The streets of Oak Ridge hummed with the sounds of a warm Friday evening, laughter spilling from diners, the distant thump of music from car stereos, and the occasional honk of impatient drivers. Neon signs flickered in the windows of small businesses, illuminating the sidewalk where Elijah Foster walked, his pride flag draped over his shoulders like a royal cape. He wasn't hiding anymore, not who he was, not what he stood for. For years, Elijah had been made to feel like an outsider in his own town, a place where being black was already enough to make him stand out, and being openly gay made him a target. But tonight, he felt different, stronger. The LGBTQ+ rally had filled him with a sense of belonging he hadn't known he needed. He had walked onto Main Street with his head held high, the fabric of his pride flag fluttering in the evening breeze. Then came the siren. It cut through the night like a blade, sharp and immediate. The patrol car swerved to a halt in front of him, red and blue lights casting eerie shadows against the brick buildings. The air grew heavier, thick with something unspoken. Elijah stopped walking, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't breaking any laws. So why did he already know what was coming? The door creaked open, and out stepped Officer Daniel Whitaker, a man Elijah had seen before, a man he'd been warned about. The officer adjusted his belt, taking his time as he approached. He was broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something that made the hair on the back of Elijah's neck stand on end. "Evening," Whitaker said, his voice smooth, almost casual. Elijah swallowed. "Evening, officer." Whitaker's gaze flicked to the flag draped over Elijah's back. His lips curled just slightly before he spoke. "Take that flag off or I'll do it for you." Elijah stiffened. The words were like ice down his spine. He gripped the fabric tighter, his fingers pressing into the material. "I have the right to wear this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping in. Whitaker took a step closer. "Not in my town, you don't." The words were loaded, thick with meaning. Elijah felt the weight of them settle on his chest, pressing down like a vice. "This is America," he said, his throat dry. "I can wear what I want." Whitaker's expression darkened. His jaw clenched as he reached for Elijah's arm. Elijah flinched back. "Don't touch me." Whitaker's hand shot out faster than Elijah could react, fingers clamping down on his wrist with bruising force. The grip sent a jolt of pain up his arm. "You're resisting," Whitaker said, his voice lower now, a dangerous edge creeping in. Elijah's breath came faster. He twisted, trying to pull away, but Whitaker tightened his hold, yanking him forward. "I said, take it off," Whitaker growled. Elijah's heart pounded. His mind screamed at him to run, but he knew better. Running would only make things worse. "Let me go," he gritted out. Whitaker ignored him. With a swift, practiced motion, he grabbed the pride flag and tore it from Elijah's shoulders. "No," Elijah shouted, his voice raw. Whitaker sneered as he let the flag drop to the pavement, then lifted his boot and pressed it down, grinding the colors into the dirt. Something inside Elijah snapped. He shoved against Whitaker's chest, his emotions boiling over. "You have no right." Whitaker reacted instantly. He spun Elijah around, slamming him against the side of the patrol car. The impact sent a shockwave of pain through Elijah's ribs. "That's assault on an officer," Whitaker said, pinning Elijah's arms behind his back. Elijah struggled, but the cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists before he could break free. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest," Whitaker announced. The street had gone silent. A few people stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching, but no one stepped forward. No one stopped it. Elijah's breaths came in sharp, ragged bursts as Whitaker shoved him toward the back of the squad car. His mind was racing. His pulse was wild. This wasn't over, not even close. The back seat of the patrol car was suffocating. The air smelled of old leather and sweat, and the hard plastic seat beneath Elijah was cold against his skin. His wrists burned where the handcuffs bit into them, the metal digging into his flesh. Every time the car jolted over a bump, he tried to shift, but Whitaker had tightened the cuffs too much on purpose. Elijah stared through the barred window as the streetlights blurred past. His heart was still racing, adrenaline pumping through his veins. But anger had begun to settle in. This wasn't just an arrest. This was something more. "Where are you taking me?" Elijah demanded, his voice sharp. Whitaker didn't answer. His hands were firm on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The dashboard lights cast a dull glow across his face, making his expression unreadable. "You didn't even read me my rights," Elijah snapped. Whitaker chuckled. "That's funny. A kid like you knowing about rights." Elijah clenched his jaw. "A kid like me?" Whitaker didn't respond right away. He turned down an unfamiliar street, one that veered away from the direction of the police station. The further they drove, the fewer streetlights there were, the houses more spread apart. Elijah's stomach twisted. "Where are we going?" he asked again, his voice lower now, tinged with unease. Whitaker finally glanced at him through the rearview mirror, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You ask too many questions." Elijah pulled against the cuffs instinctively, his pulse kicking up again. "You can't just take me somewhere without..." "Without what?" Whitaker interrupted, his tone mocking. "Without permission, without probable cause. Let me tell you something, boy." He dragged out the word, letting it linger like an insult. "No one cares what happens to you. No one's coming to save you." Elijah swallowed, his mind spinning. The way Whitaker had said it made his blood run cold. They weren't going to the station. They weren't going anywhere he could call for help. He pressed his shoulders back against the seat, trying to steady himself. He wouldn't panic. Not yet. Outside the window, the houses disappeared altogether, replaced by dark stretches of open land. They were heading toward the outskirts of town, where the roads led to abandoned lots, old warehouses, and woods that swallowed everything whole. "You can't do this," Elijah said, forcing steel into his voice. Whitaker chuckled again, low and slow. "I can do whatever I want." Elijah's throat tightened. He tested the cuffs again, twisting his wrists, but they wouldn't budge. His breath came faster. He wasn't going to sit there and let whatever was about to happen. His mind raced. The door was locked. The front seat was blocked by the metal barrier. But if he didn't do something soon, they would be off the main roads completely. He shifted in his seat, moving his feet, trying to position himself. Whitaker must have noticed, because he suddenly swerved the car hard to the right. The motion threw Elijah sideways, slamming him against the door. "Don't even think about it," Whitaker warned. Elijah's pulse pounded in his ears. He had to act fast. His eyes flicked to the small gap between the door and the seat. If he could angle himself right, without hesitating, he braced his back against the seat and brought his legs up. Then he kicked hard. The heel of his sneaker slammed against the window with a loud crack. Whitaker cursed, jerking the wheel. "You little..." Elijah kicked again. The glass splintered but didn't shatter. The car skidded to a stop, tires kicking up gravel. Whitaker reached for his gun. "You're gonna regret that." Elijah's breath came fast, but he didn't stop moving. He had one chance, one moment. The door was locked from the inside. But if he could break the glass, he twisted his body, lifting both feet this time. And with every ounce of strength he had left, he kicked a window again. This time, it shattered. Cold air rushed in. Elijah didn't hesitate. He threw himself forward, twisting his body and forcing his legs through the broken window. Whitaker shouted, but Elijah wasn't listening. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto his side as pain shot through his shoulder. But he was free, for now. The gravel bit into Elijah's skin as he hit the ground, the shattered glass scattering around him like ice. His shoulder throbbed from the impact, but he didn't have time to feel the pain. Not with Whitaker roaring behind him. "Get back here, boy." Elijah pushed himself up, his hands still bound behind his back, his heart slamming against his ribs. His feet scrambled against the loose gravel as he took off running, lungs burning, muscles coiling like a spring. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to move. Behind him, Whitaker's boots crunched against the ground as he rounded the car. The cop was fast too fast for a man his size, but Elijah had something Whitaker didn't: fear, adrenaline, the raw, desperate will to survive. The night swallowed him as he sprinted toward the woods, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The open land was a death trap too exposed, too easy for Whitaker to catch up. But the trees meant cover. The trees meant a chance. Gunfire exploded behind him. A shot cracked through the night, ripping through the silence like a blade. Elijah ducked on instinct, throwing himself low to the ground. The bullet struck a tree just ahead of him, splintering the bark in a burst of wood chips. Whitaker was shooting at him, not warning shots, not to scare him, to hit him. Elijah's mind screamed at him to move, to keep going. He forced himself up and dove into the tree line, the thick undergrowth tearing at his legs as he stumbled forward. His arms ached from the cuffs, his balance off, without his hands free, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Another shot rang out. It whizzed past his ear, close enough that he felt the air shift. Terror clawed at his throat, but he gritted his teeth and pushed deeper into the woods. Behind him, Whitaker cursed. "You can't run forever." Elijah didn't answer. He was too busy trying to survive. The forest was thick, branches clawing at his clothes, roots waiting to trip him. His breath was loud in his ears, but he forced himself to listen for Whitaker's movements, for the sound of boots crunching leaves. The officer was close, too close. Elijah swerved hard to the right, slipping down a small incline, his feet barely keeping up with his body as he tumbled forward. He hit the ground hard but rolled, using the momentum to get back up. Whitaker was still behind him, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness like a blade. "Nowhere to go, boy," Whitaker taunted. "You think you can outrun me? I knew these woods better than you." Elijah gritted his teeth. He needed a plan, fast. His hands were still cuffed. He couldn't climb, couldn't fight, but he could hide. Up ahead, a thick patch of underbrush loomed, like a shadow. It was his only chance. He lunged toward it, throwing himself into the tangled mess of leaves and thorns, ignoring the way the branches scratched his skin. He flattened himself against the dirt, pressing his body as low as possible. Then he went still, silent. His heartbeat was a war drum in his chest, each thud hammering against his ribs as he forced himself to breathe shallow, quiet breaths. The flashlight beam swept past him once, twice. Whitaker's heavy footsteps slowed. Elijah could hear him breathing, the low rasp of frustration, the way the man muttered under his breath. "Little bastard," Whitaker growled. "You really think I won't find you?" Elijah didn't move, didn't flinch. The flashlight flickered past again, but this time, it lingered a little too long. Elijah's stomach twisted. Then a sound, distant, a rustling in the opposite direction. Whitaker turned toward it immediately, his flashlight whipping away. Elijah's breath caught. An animal, a deer maybe, and Whitaker was going after it. The moment the officer moved away, Elijah exhaled shakily, forcing himself to think. He had a small window, a chance to move, before Whitaker circled back. His hands were still cuffed, but that didn't matter. He wasn't going to let this be the end. Not tonight, not ever. Elijah lay frozen beneath the tangled underbrush, his heart hammering so hard he feared it might give him away. Whitaker's footsteps faded. Slightly, the officer trudging toward the sound that had distracted him. But Elijah knew it wouldn't last. Whitaker would realize his mistake soon enough. This was his only chance. His wrists throbbed from the tightness of the cuffs, the cold metal biting into his skin. He twisted them, testing for any weakness. Nothing. He had to move now. Taking a slow, steady breath, he pushed himself up with his knees, using his shoulder to brace against a tree. Every muscle in his body ached from the chase, but he forced himself forward, keeping low. Leaves crunched in the distance. Whitaker was still nearby. Elijah scanned the forest. His vision had adjusted to the darkness now, revealing a path. Ahead, a shallow ditch leading toward a creek bed. If he could get to the water, he might be able to throw Whitaker off his trail. He inched forward, careful to keep his movement silent. Each step felt like a lifetime. His pulse roared in his ears, but he kept going, sliding down the small incline toward the ditch. His sneakers slipped on the damp earth, but he caught himself before he fell. Then, a shout. "There you are, boy." Elijah's blood turned to ice. Whitaker's flashlight cut through the trees like a blade, locking onto him. "Thought you could hide from me." Whitaker's voice was laced with amusement, but there was something else in it, too, something dark. Elijah didn't think. He ran. He sprinted down the slope, his feet barely keeping up with his momentum. Whitaker was keeping up with his momentum. Whitaker was crashing through the woods behind him, the officer's boots pounding against the earth. Elijah hit the bottom of the incline, his feet splashing into the creek. The icy water soaked his shoes instantly, sending a jolt of cold up his legs. He didn't slow down. His mind raced. He needed to break the cuffs, needed to put as much distance between himself and Whitaker as possible. Up ahead, a fallen tree stretched across the creek. If he could make it past that. A shot rang out. The bullet struck the water near his feet, sending up a sharp spray. Elijah's breath hitched. He scrambled onto the fallen tree, gripping it with his bound hands. His balance wavered. The wet bark was slick beneath his shoes. Another shot. This one tore through the wood near his knee. He had seconds. Elijah lunged forward, throwing himself off the log just as another bullet cracked through the air. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto his side, pain shooting through his ribs. He gasped for breath, his vision swimming. Whitaker was closing in. Elijah's eyes darted around. The trees, the creek, the tangled undergrowth. He needed a weapon. Needed. There. A jagged rock, half buried in the mud. Elijah scrambled for it, his fingers curling around the rough edges. His wrists screamed in protest as he twisted, bringing the rock up to his cuffs. Whitaker's footsteps thundered toward him. Elijah slammed the rock against the chain of the cuffs. Once, twice. The metal didn't break, but it bent just slightly. Whitaker was nearly on top of him now. Elijah gritted his teeth. He swung the rock again, harder this time. A sickening crack. Pain exploded through his wrist, but the chain snapped. Elijah barely had time to register before Whitaker lunged. The officer tackled him, slamming him onto his back. The impact knocked the air from Elijah's lungs, his vision flashing white with pain. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Whitaker growled, his weight pressing Elijah into the dirt. Elijah gasped for air, his free hand scrambling against the ground. The rock was gone, lost in the struggle. Whitaker's hand clamped around Elijah's throat. "You think you're special, don't you?" Officer's grip tightened. "Walking around with that damn flag like you own the place. Like you're untouchable." Elijah choked, his fingers clawing at Whitaker's arm, his lungs burned, his vision darkening at the edges. "You people never learn," Whitaker spat. "But I'm gonna teach you." Elijah's world was slipping away. His limbs grew weak. The weight on his chest was unbearable. No, he wasn't going to let it end like this. With the last of his strength, he twisted his body, using the slick mud beneath him to his advantage. He wrenched his knee up, slamming it into Whitaker's ribs. The officer grunted in surprise. The grip on Elijah's throat loosened just enough. Elijah used the moment to roll, throwing Whitaker off balance. He gasped in air, his throat raw, his mind screaming at him to move. He shoved Whitaker back, scrambling to his feet. The officer cursed, reaching for his gun, but Elijah was faster. He ran again, his breath ragged, his body screaming in protest. But he wasn't stopping now, not when he was so close. Elijah's legs burned as he pushed himself forward, every step a struggle. His body screamed for rest, for relief, but he didn't dare slow down. Not now, not with Whitaker right behind him, his boots crashing against the earth with deadly purpose. The trees blurred around him, their branches like dark fingers reaching for him. But Elijah didn't dare look back. He had to focus. He had to get out of these woods, out of the reach of the officer who was hunting him like prey. His lungs burned. His feet slipped in the mud. But he couldn't stop. There was only one way out of this. He had to make it to the road. The thought spurred him on, adrenaline coursing through his veins. His arms swung wildly, desperate to maintain his balance as he stumbled over a large root and nearly fell. Ahead, he saw a clearing, a small stretch of open land that led to the road beyond. His heart leapt. He wasn't far. The sound of Whitaker's pursuit was growing louder, closer, his footsteps gaining ground with every second. Elijah could almost feel the man's presence on his heels, the hot breath of the officer's rage closing in. Then, a shout. "You can't outrun me, boy," Whitaker bellowed. The words echoed through the forest, and Elijah didn't need any more encouragement. He pushed harder, his legs screaming as he fought through the final stretch. He was so close. He burst out of the woods into the clearing. The road was just ahead. But then, a flash of light. Elijah's body froze. Headlights? A car. It was barreling down the road, too fast. The car's headlights caught him, blinding him for a moment. As he skidded to a halt, the vehicle screeched to a stop just feet away from him, sending gravel and dirt flying. Elijah didn't know what to do. He was caught between two threats, Whitaker behind him, and now the car blocking his only escape. The door to the car swung open, and a voice shouted, "Get in." It was a woman's voice, urgent, desperate. Without thinking, Elijah scrambled forward, throwing himself into the open car door. The woman inside didn't hesitate. She slammed the door shut, and the car peeled out, tires spinning as they tore down the road. Behind them, Whitaker's shout was lost in the roar of the engine. Elijah's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his pulse still racing. The woman didn't speak at first, her eyes fixed on the road as she drove like a woman possessed. Elijah glanced at her, his heart still pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he gasped, his voice shaking. She didn't answer right away. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. But then she glanced at him. "I don't have time to explain," she said, her tone sharp. "But I'm not letting you die tonight." The words hit Elijah like a slap. He didn't know who she was, or why she'd helped him. But right now, he didn't care. She had pulled him out of the jaws of hell. "You didn't have to do this," Elijah said, his voice hoarse. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes remained focused on the road ahead. "I wasn't about to let a cop murder someone for wearing a flag." Elijah blinked, surprised by the raw anger in her voice. The car roared down the dark road, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the rush of wind against the windows. Elijah felt a strange sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing unease. They were still running. They were still on the run. Elijah's gaze flickered to the rearview mirror. He half expected to see the flashing lights of a squad car, but the road behind them was dark. No sirens, no flashing blue and red. "Where are we going?" Elijah finally asked. The woman didn't answer at first, her jaw tight as she pushed the car even faster. "You're not safe," she said, her voice low. "Not in that town. Not with people like him in charge." Elijah's chest tightened. "Who are you?" The woman didn't look at him again. "Just someone who's had enough." The silence stretched between them as the car sped through the night. Elijah didn't know where they were headed, or if he could even trust this stranger. But right now, she was his only chance. But as the miles passed and the town faded behind them, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't out of danger yet, that Whitaker was still out there, and the next time they met, it wouldn't be a chase anymore. The car slowed as they approached a small, run-down cabin nestled deep in the woods. The headlights cut through the dark, revealing only the faint outline of the structure. Elijah's heart still pounded in his chest as the car came to a stop. The woman killed the engine and turned to him. "This is where we part ways," he said, her voice steady but tight. "I can't take you any further." Elijah blinked in confusion. "Wait, what? Why are we stopping here?" The woman reached for the door handle, but Elijah grabbed her wrist. "No," he said, his voice cracking. You can't just leave me here. I don't know where else to go." Her eyes softened for a moment, but she gently pulled her wrist from his grip. "You're not safe. Whitaker's not the only one after you." Elijah felt a chill spread through him. He pulled back, staring at her in disbelief. "Who else? Who's after me?" The woman sighed, her gaze flickering to the cabin. "There's a network. People like Whitaker, people who think they can control the world with their power, their hate. I'm part of that network, but it's dangerous. You've already seen how far they'll go." Elijah swallowed, his throat dry. "So, what now? I just hide here, alone." She hesitated. "I can't promise you safety. No one can. But I can give you time. You need to find your own way." "Time for what?" Elijah asked. "Time until they come for me again." The woman's jaw tightened. "They will, but you have something they can't take. You have strength, you have your voice. And that's more dangerous than you think." Elijah's mind raced as he tried to understand what she was saying. He'd been running for so long, fighting for so long, but the fight wasn't over. "Listen," the woman said, her eyes softening with a kind of understanding. "There are people out there who need to hear your story. People who will stand with you." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to him. "This is a contact, someone who can help, but you have to be ready to speak out. You can't let this moment slip away." Elijah looked at the paper, his fingers trembling as he took it. "And what if they come for me before I can speak? What if they don't let me tell the truth?" The woman's gaze hardened, her voice low. "Then you fight. You don't let them silence you. Not now, not ever." Elijah felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. Heavy but resolute, he looked down at the paper in his hand. The promise of something more, something bigger. The sound of tires screeching in the distance brought Elijah's attention back to the road. The car, the same one that had driven him to safety, was coming back. The woman's face darkened. "Get inside," she ordered. "Now." Elijah didn't question her. He jumped out of the car and sprinted toward the cabin, his heart racing once again. He slammed the door behind him just as the woman pulled her own gun from the glove compartment. Through the thin walls, Elijah could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, the unmistakable crunch of gravel. Elijah pressed himself against the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he peered outside. A black SUV was parked at the edge of the clearing, its engine still running. 3 men in dark suits stepped out, their silhouettes harsh against the glow of the headlights. "Get out of here," the woman whispered, her voice tight. "They're with Whitaker. They're here for you." Elijah's blood ran cold. He couldn't go back. He couldn't go out there and face them. But he couldn't stay here either. His gaze turned to the back door of the cabin. There had to be another way out. Before he could make his move, the door to the cabin was kicked open with a force that rattled the walls. The woman raised her gun, but one of the men stepped into the doorway, his hands raised in a gesture of mock surrender. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, his voice smooth, calm. "We're here for the kid." The woman's gun wavered, but she didn't lower it. "I'm not handing him over." "Then you're in the way," the man said, his eyes narrowed. "Step aside." The woman's grip on the gun tightened. "Not a chance." Elijah's heart thudded in his chest. He had no idea what was happening. But one thing was clear: these men weren't going to leave without him. He turned toward the back door, making a quick decision. There was no time to think. He had to run. He flung open the door and darted into the woods, the cold night air rushing against his face. Behind him, he heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, fast, closing in. The men were following him, but Elijah wasn't going to stop. Not now. He wasn't just running from Whitaker anymore. He was running toward something, toward his voice, toward his future. And he wasn't going to let anyone silence him. Not now, not ever. If you like this story, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, in order to strengthen our community, I would like to know where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video.